welcome to the first video of your Theme 6 notes. So Theme 6, as you know, is focusing on eukaryotes. So we're going to go ahead and get started with Protists. So Kingdom Protista is also, as it's known, a little introduction. All protists are eukaryotes. So sometimes because they're single-celled, they tend to get mistaken for bacteria, but they actually are eukaryotic cells. They can reproduce asexually or sexually, and most of them are single-celled. There are a few that are multi, though. They were the first eukaryotes on Earth, and they must have moisture to survive. They're also the most diverse group of organisms, and that's why they're referred to as the junk drawer kingdom. Basically, when you think about your junk drawer at home, you have a lot of stuff in it, some random things, some keys, some batteries, matches, candles, I don't know, lots of stuff, right? So it's all in common because it's all junk, but it's not necessarily that closely related. So that's kind of how we view this kingdom. First of all, there's a term called endosymbiosis that you need to be aware of. It's also sometimes referred to as the endosymbiotic theory or the endosymbiont theory. All means the same thing. So it's just that. It's a theory that explains the origin of eukaryotes and complex organelles, things like mitochondria and chloroplast. The idea is that a large prokaryote engulfed a smaller prokaryote and they lived together symbiotically. So it tried to eat it and it lived inside of its body, to where eventually these two organisms evolved into a single organism. Just a theory in terms of how eukaryotes came to be around. So there's some ways that we classify protists. First of all, there are 3 types of protists, and these are classified into these types based on how they get their nutrition. So if you remember, a heterotroph has to consume other things to get its food. That's the animal-like protist. An autotroph makes its own food. Those are the plant-like protists. And then a saprotroph, or a detritivore, feeds on dead and decaying things, and those are the fungus-like protists. There's also some important structures you need to be aware of. So when you see the term flagella, which is actually plural, flagellum would be singular, it's just the tail or tails that help with movement. As you can see in this picture over here, this organism has several flagella. Pseudopods are also a really common term we'll come across, and that's just simply the temporary projection of the cytoplasm. So this is kind of, if you look down here, it's a step-by-step process. So step 1, step 2, step 3. So it's trying to get this food particle, so the cytoplasm kind of projects out like a mouth. Then you see it closes around to where it's inside, and then you just have those pseudopods again. So some other important structures you need to be aware of include cilia, which are just hair-like projections. You should be familiar with this from our bacteria conversations. There's also 2 types of nuclei. So there's a macronucleus and a micronucleus. So think macro, think big. That's the main nucleus. It has the main copy of the genetic info. Micro, think small. It's kind of your backup copy. It's like your flash drive or maybe an outside hard drive you may have on a computer. And then you also have the contractile vacuole, which when you think of contracting, it's squishing together. So the contractile vacuole, there's 2 in this picture. They look like little starbursts, and they contract to squeeze out that excess water from the protist. 2 other things we need to be aware of is the pellicle, which is just a layered structure. It supports the cell membrane and allows them to keep their shape. They don't have cell walls, so they are just cytoplasm in that cell membrane. There's also trichocysts, and these are pellicle-type structures for projection, and it also secures them during feeding. If you look at this picture here, it's this little spike that's sticking out. All right, so we're first going to talk about animal-like protists. These are, like we said, heterotrophs, so they have to consume other things for their food. They are single-celled. They eat things like algae, bacteria, even other protists. And they're known as the protozoan. So this is an important term you need to know. And protozoan simply means pre-animal. So they're before animals. And they are grouped according to how they move. Now each type or group of protist is further grouped according to a specific trait. So it's really important that you make very careful note of this in your notes and you understand and remember how these different groups are grouped. So a little more about the protozoans. So there's mobile and non-mobile species. Now the mobile species have 3 different phyla. So you'll see I've outlined those here for you. The first phylum is Sarcodina. Now these use those pseudopods that we just talked about, and that's how they move and eat. An example of this is an amoeba, and we'll look at that in class. The next one is phylum Zoomastogyna. Now these ones have one or more flagella. So an example is Giardia, and actually the picture when we were talking about flagella showed Giardia. That's in contaminated water. It's very, very common. People get very sick from this. Also trypanosoma, which causes something called sleeping sickness. The final mobile phylum is Ciliophora. Now these use cilia to move and eat, so they don't use those pseudopods like Sarcodina uses. They instead use all those little hairs. The non-mobile species, on the other hand, are all parasites. And there's one phylum, Apicomplexa, and these are just located in blood or intestines. So there's some examples here. Plasmodium is responsible for malaria. Toxoplasma is in cat feces, and it can be transmitted to different animals and humans. And Coccidia is a really, really common kitten and puppy parasite. Next up, the plant-like protists. So these are referred to as the algae. So the animal protists are the protozoans. The plant-like protists are typically referred to as the algae. They are autotrophs, so they make their own food. They can be single-celled or multi-celled, and they contain chlorophyll and other pigments. You'll see examples of these protists that are not green, so they have to have those other pigments in them. Also, interestingly enough, protists produce 50% of the Earth's total oxygen. That is a huge amount of oxygen that these little protists do that you probably don't even realize. And them, on the other hand, are classified into 6 phyla based on color or pigment and their structure. So the animal ones were based on a different trait than the plant-like ones. So make sure you're keeping this straight in your notes. So like I said, they're called the algae, or the phytoplankton is also another term. And there's 6 different kinds we're going to briefly go over. So the euglenoids, these ones do photosynthesis and they move using flagella. An example is euglena, and that's actually this picture right here is a euglena, and we will hopefully get to see some of those under the microscope as well. Diatoms are most of what's referred to as the phytoplankton. So these actually store food as oil, and they have really, really cool geometric shapes, and they're actually used in toothpaste, interestingly enough. So a picture of those is here. You see all those really, really cool, unique shapes they have. Dinoflagellates, on the other hand, they have flagella, as their name suggests, and they're typically helmet-shaped, and they spin as they move. So these are pretty cool. We won't get to look at these, but they are really neat when you can see them. And they can actually be bioluminescent, but they do also have some issues because they're causing red tides. So if you've ever learned anything about red tides, it's a big algae bloom that causes a lot of different animals to die due to lack of oxygen and nutrients and all those kinds of things. So these dinoflagellates can cause red tides. There's also chrysophytes. Now these are golden algae. They also store food as oil like the diatoms. And then we have 2 more types of algae. We have red algae and brown algae. So red algae are your red seaweeds. They're multicellular and they're marine, so they're in salt water. And they're also found in ice cream, interestingly enough. Brown algae, on the other hand, is also multicellular, and it's kelp. So if you see, this is a scuba diver in a kelp forest, and if you remember the types of animals that like kelp, otters really like, or sorry, yes, the sea urchins live in the kelp forest. So that's how they get their kelp. There's also a lot of starfish, and there's some stuff we'll get into with that later on in this unit. Finally is the fungus-like protists. So these are known as saprophytes because they feed on decaying matter, and this is how they absorb their nutrients. Their cell walls have cellulose, and they're also very brightly colored if they're a slime mold. So there are slime molds, water molds, and then something called ick in fish. If you've ever had an aquarium, you're probably very familiar with this disease. So slime molds and water molds, there are 3 different phyla that we'll talk about here. So phylum Myxomycota, these are plasmoidal slime molds. Now, these are just like those amoebas that we talked about. They have like a pseudopod, and they kind of reach out, and that's how they move and they get their food. But they keep feeding and growing this whole big slime mold until they run out of environment, or it's just too dry. Because remember, protists need moisture to survive. But they can actually be up to 1 meter, which is huge. The next one is phylum Acrasiomycota. Now these are cellular slime molds. So they're not made of the same material as the plasmodial, but they do look very similar. They can also form something called a slug, which is this picture here. And that's how they kind of avoid what the plasmoidal slime molds run into, because they can actually migrate during a food shortage, and this is also how they form their reproductive structures. Finally is phylum Oomycota. Now these are water molds and downy mildew, so these are not slime molds, and they're usually just a fuzzy mass of threads. They often get mistaken for fungus because of what they look like, and they do cause disease in fish and plants as well. So you can see the plant that you see there, and then you see this fish has the water mold on it as well. And that is all for your notes for protists.